In this report, I will first address the process of deindustrialization and financialization of the U.S. economy, which underlies the decline and bankruptcy of Detroit. I will then review in greater detail the impoverishment of former industrial cities at the hands of the corporations and banks. Next, I will focus in on Detroit and examine the real reasons for the city's financial crisis and the social consequences of that crisis. Finally, I will provide examples of the stratospheric levels of social inequality in Detroit. The bankruptcy of Detroit is the outcome of a process that spans many decades. Over the past 35 years, the American ruling class, represented by Democratic as well as Republican governments, has dismantled much of the industrial infrastructure of the country. It has shifted its money-making activities increasingly to parasitic and non-productive forms of financial speculation. We use the term financialization to characterize this process. We mean by it the increasing weight of financial operations carried out by banks, hedge funds, and other financial firms in the overall economic life of both the U.S. and the world. The financialization of the U.S. economy, its increasing domination by a handful of Wall Street banks and hedge funds, has been dramatic. In 1980, the financial industry accounted for only 6% of corporate profits in the U.S. Today, it accounts for close to 50%. The other side of the coin is the collapse of manufacturing. Manufacturing today accounts for just 12% of the U.S. economy, down from a peak of 28% in 1953, and on a par with France and Britain as the least industrialized of major economies. I will deal with the dismantling of industry in the U.S. in greater detail later in this report. First, however, it is important to stress that deindustrialization and financialization are not simply impersonal economic processes. They are bound up with the class struggle. They have played a central role in the offensive of the ruling class against the social conditions and basic rights of the working class. These processes accelerated in the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s, and sharply intensified following the Wall Street crash of September 2008. In Detroit and other industrial cities, the capitalists have discarded workers, whose labor they have come to rely on less than previously as the direct source of their profits, as they shifted production to cheap labor havens in Asia, Eastern Europe, Latin America, and elsewhere. They came to rely more on other ways of making money off of the backs of workers in cities such as Detroit, including forcing them into debt and extracting tribute in the form of interest on loans. The result has been the devastation of former industrial cities all across the United States. Detroit has been transformed from the most prosperous city per capita in the country in 1950 to the poorest big city in the U.S. But it is only the most graphic example of a broader process. Allow me to quote from a New York Times article that appeared last November, headlined, "Many Cities Opt to Clear Faded Areas." The article makes clear that the downsizing and restructuring of Detroit is part of a nationwide phenomenon. It quotes Sandra Pianalto, chief executive of the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland, as saying, "The best policy to stabilize neighborhoods may not always be rehabilitation. It may be demolition." Large-scale destruction is well known in Detroit, but it is also underway in Baltimore, Philadelphia, Cleveland, Cincinnati, Buffalo, and other cities. Officials are tearing down tens of thousands of vacant buildings, many perfectly habitable. The article points out that more than half of the nation's 20 largest cities in 1950, more than half, have lost at least 1/3 of their populations. Since 2000, Baltimore, St. Louis, Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, and Buffalo have lost around 10%. Cleveland has lost more than 17%, and more than 25% of residents have left Detroit. Cleveland, whose population has shrunk by about 80,000 during the past decade, according to the article, quote, zones for urban farms and allows people to keep pigs, sheep, and goats in residential areas, end quote. In the rise and fall of American manufacturing and growth of financial parasitism, one sees the historical trajectory of the rise and decline of American capitalism. It is no accident that this process of decay finds its sharpest expression in the rise and decline of Detroit. In the first 3/4 of the 20th century, the United States became the dominant economic power in the world. It did so on the basis of the scale, power, efficiency, and technological supremacy of its industry. The auto industry was at the center of the industrial might of American capitalism, and the center of the auto industry, both in the U.S. and internationally, was Detroit. The mass production methods that transformed the world were developed and perfected in the United States. Henry Ford set up the first operational auto assembly line in 1913 in Highland Park. His innovation reduced the time it took to build a car from more than 12 hours to 2 hours and 30 minutes. Detroit's population rose from less than 500,000 in 1910 to over 1.5 million in 1930. When World War II ended, Detroit was the 4th largest city in the U.S. In 1950, its population was close to 2 million. In the early 1950s, the U.S. produced nearly 3/4 of all cars made around the world. In 1952, nearly 60% of all industrial production in the advanced capitalist countries was located in the U.S. The global dominance of U.S. industry could not be sustained forever. Industrial production, like all other facets of social life, was subordinated to the accumulation of personal wealth by the elite social layer that owned and controlled the factories, the means of transportation, the natural resources, the technology, and the finance, that is, the means of production. And the world economy, increasingly integrated on a global scale, remained hemmed in and held back by the division of the world into rival nation states. The basic contradictions of capitalism between social production and private ownership of the means of production, between the growth of the productive forces and the irrationality and anarchy of the capitalist market, between world economy and the national state system, increasingly asserted themselves internationally. This mounting world crisis was centered in the decline in the global economic position of the United States. As Europe and Japan recovered from the devastation of World War II, American industry, including the Detroit-based Big Three automakers, was increasingly challenged by German and Japanese corporations. U.S. manufacturers lost market share, including within the U.S. itself, to their overseas rivals. Moreover, the rate of profit for U.S. manufacturing began to decline. A major factor in this process was the militant resistance of the working class, which carried out mass strikes to press for higher wages, pensions, health benefits, and better working conditions. The response of the American ruling class was to shift away from production to financial speculation. The capitalists found they could make more money through financial wheeling and dealing than they could through the production of useful things, autos, steel, homes, schools. And by downsizing industry, they could use layoffs and the threat of layoffs to undermine the militancy of the working class and take back what they had been forced to concede to the workers in previous decades. With the assistance of the treacherous leadership of the United Auto Workers and the other unions, they could use plant closures and layoffs to blackmail workers into accepting cuts in wages and benefits, as well as speed up. As manufacturing was dismantled and economic activities shifted more and more to financial manipulation, the enrichment of the financial corporate elite was increasingly separated from the creation of real value through the process of production. While there was a certain increase in the total output of U.S. manufacturing measured in dollars, the number of jobs continued to decline, so that any increase in manufacturing output was based on increased productivity, automation, speed up. In other words, increasing the rate at which the labor of workers was exploited by the capitalists. Here are some indices of the decline of manufacturing in the U.S. in general and Detroit in particular. In the U.S. as a whole, the United States lost approximately 42,400 factories between 2001 and 2010. The United States lost 32% of its manufacturing jobs between 2000 and 2010. Since 1979, 267 of the 447 auto manufacturing plants in the U.S. have been closed, or 60%. Of those that closed, 42% shut down between 2004 and 2010. The number of manufacturing jobs in Detroit proper fell from 296,000 in 1950 to 27,000 in 2011. In 1960, there were 35 major auto plants in and around Detroit, including the Ford Rouge complex, GM's Cadillac plant, and Dodge, Maine, employing over 110,000 workers. Today, there are 14 employing less than 22,000 workers. Since 1989, auto-related employment in Michigan has declined by 70%. 61 auto plants, large and small, have been closed in the Detroit metro area since 1979. And from 2000 to 2008, Metro Detroit lost 150,000 jobs due to downsizing in the auto industry. Corporate America laid waste to industrial cities across the U.S. The epidemic of plant closures and mass layoffs undermined the financial position of the cities. Mass unemployment and declining population depleted income and sales tax revenues. The shutting of plants and urban decay sapped property tax revenues. At the same time, both federal and state aid to cities was repeatedly cut. Now here we come to the question of corporate tax abatements that was raised earlier in the discussion. Corporations took advantage of the crisis of the cities to blackmail them into giving ever more massive tax breaks and incentives as the price for keeping existing plants open or choosing to locate new facilities within their borders. According to the New York Times, states, counties, and cities hand out $80 billion a year to corporations in the form of tax abatements and other incentives. Among the firms on the receiving end, as this chart shows, Walmart, the world's most profitable corporation, which gets $1.2 billion in taxpayer assistance, Alcoa, which has a 30-year discounted electricity deal worth $5.6 billion, Boeing, which receives tax breaks and subsidies estimated at $3.2 billion, Nike, $2.02 billion, Intel, $2 billion, Google, $255 million to locate a facility with 250 jobs. That actually comes to $1,020,000 per job. But actually, Google is far outdone by Apple. Apple gets $320 million to set up shop in North Carolina, producing 50 jobs. That comes to $6,420,000 per job. Goldman Sachs got $164 million to move operations from Manhattan to Jersey City, and overall, national incentives for the big three auto companies since 1985 are estimated at $13.9 billion. The state of Michigan spends $6.65 billion every year on business incentives. That represents 30 cents out of every dollar in the state budget. When we talk about looting and plunder, these are not hyperboles. These are not exaggerations. Desperate for cash, cities have increasingly placed themselves in hock to the banks and hedge funds. The financial industry, vampire-like, has exploited the crisis of the cities to entrap them in predatory loans and financial arrangements that have further bankrupted the cities while providing huge profits for the banks and bondholders. A measure of the increasing hold of the financial industry over U.S. cities is the fact that the U.S. municipal bond market has almost doubled since 2005, growing from $1.9 trillion to $3.7 trillion. State and municipal pension funds have been looted by state and local officials to cover lost revenues and pay off debts to the banks. Politicians of both parties have systematically underfunded them, placing at risk the pension benefits that legally belong to retired state and city workers. The pension funds have increasingly entered into highly risky and exotic borrowing arrangements with financial firms, which end up funneling hundreds of millions and billions of dollars from the pension funds to banks, hedge funds, and private equity companies. There is $2.6 trillion in state pension money under management in the U.S. Wall Street wants that cash. It sees no reason why it should be squandered on retired workers who no longer produce profit for American business. Particularly since the Wall Street crash and onset of the Great Recession, a virtual conspiracy between billionaire capitalists, think tanks, foundations, and trust funds, such as the venerable Pew Charitable Trust, and politicians, backed by the corporate-controlled media, has been at work to brainwash the public into believing that overly generous pension benefits are bankrupting the country. The basic aim is to end defined benefit pensions for public sector workers and replace them with 401k plans, just as corporations in the private sector have done. In 2011, the town of Central Falls, Rhode Island, filed for bankruptcy protection in a small-scale trial run for the Bankruptcy of Detroit. Under the court-supervised, quote, rescue, end quote, plan, retiree pensions were cut by up to 55%. The state government, which had disastrously underfunded the state pension system, contracted hedge funds to secure financing for the pension plan. With the hedge funds charging exorbitant fees, far higher than those charged by a typical bank, it is estimated that the state will pay $2.1 billion in fees over the next 20 years. This nearly matches the $2.3 billion the state will take away from workers over the same period by freezing their cost of living adjustments. All of the above-noted factors, population loss, loss of tax revenues, federal and state funding cuts, corporate blackmail, and financial gouging, have intensified greatly since the onset of the global slump in 2008. All of these processes are involved in the financial crisis and bankruptcy of Detroit. The official narrative, promoted by emergency manager or city and state politicians of both parties, the bankruptcy judge and the media, is that the bankruptcy is the result of overly generous benefits for city workers and retirees. The people of Detroit have simply been living beyond their means. Now it is necessary to make, quote, hard choices, end quote, and, quote, bite the bullet, end quote. That is, to accept a massive reduction in pensions, health benefits, and overall living standards for working people and youth. An examination of the facts shows that this narrative is a lie. There has been a sustained and ruthless attack on social services in Detroit and the jobs, wages, and benefits of city workers for decades. That assault was intensified in the 2000s. 3,000 city workers were laid off between 2003 and 2005. But the Wall Street crash of 2008 and ensuing recession marked a huge escalation both in the economic crisis of the city and the attack on Detroit workers. It was not rising pension and health care costs that turned the decline into a collapse, but rather the consequences of the orgy of speculation and profiteering on Wall Street. In Detroit, 2008 was the beginning not of a recession, but a depression. The number of employed city residents fell by 53% from 2000 through 2012. But half of that decline occurred in 1 year, 2008. In that 1 year, the official unemployment rate in Detroit doubled from 14% to 28%. There were tens of thousands of home foreclosures in Detroit in 2008. Property tax valuations have declined 12% in Detroit since that year. As a result of job losses, foreclosures, and other effects of the national and global economic crisis, city revenues fell sharply. Since 2008, they have decreased by more than 20%, declining $277.5 million. The collapse of city revenues has been exacerbated by cuts in aid from both the federal and state governments. 24% of the decrease was from cuts in state revenue sharing. 23% was from cuts in other revenue, including federal aid. In the critical years 2011 and through 2013, when the city's revenues fell by $200 million, 29% of the decrease was from cuts in state revenue sharing, 30% from cuts in other funds, and 25% from a fall in property taxes. Over these years, 2011 through 2013, the state cut $60 million in revenue sharing. Another factor in the revenue decline was tax abatements handed out by the city to private interests. Over $20 million a year was awarded to companies such as Detroit Medical Center, DTE Energy, Comerica Bank, Rock Ventures, Garbsman, CompuWare, and Quicken Loans. The response of city officials to the fall in revenues was to escalate the attack on the working class. This is reflected in the decline in the city's outlays between 2008 and the present. Over that period, the city's total expenses decreased by $356.3 million. This decline is the result of a $419 million decline, that is a massive 38%, in operating expenses, which has been partly offset by a $63 million increase in so-called legacy costs. How was the $419 million cut in operating expenses achieved? By laying off more than 2,350 workers, cutting workers' pay, and reducing future health care and pension benefits for workers. The city reduced salary expenses by 30% and cut its workforce by 20% between fiscal year 2008 and fiscal year 2013. Legacy costs, which grew by $63 million, consist of funding for pensions, health benefits, and debt payments to banks and investors. Here, one sees clearly the predatory role of the financial industry. Despite the talk of workers' pensions bankrupting Detroit, the city's pension expenses between 2000 and 2013 rose by only $2 million. The city's health care expenses increased by $24.3 million, an annual increase of 3.25%, less than the average national yearly increase in health care costs of 4%. The biggest single factor in the increase in legacy costs was the city's financial expenses, which increased by $38.5 million between fiscal year 2008 and fiscal year 2013, accounting for more than 60% of the total increase in legacy expenses. The actual sums paid by the city to bankers, bondholders, and major investors are staggering. According to emergency manager Orr, the city has a cash flow shortfall of $198 million. Yet during 2011 and 2012 alone, the city paid $547 million in termination benefits on financial deals that had been terminated because of a credit rating downgrade of the city. The total outlay in 2013 for financial obligations was $247.4 million. I have a section here which I'm actually not going to go into for time reasons, but the single most sort of devastating financial deal was the now famous or infamous deal signed by Kwame Kilpatrick in 2005-2006, in which the city borrowed $1.4 billion from UBS, which is a Swiss-based bank, and Merrill Lynch, which has since been taken over by Bank of America, to fund the pension system. And they did this on the basis of an exotic thing called certificates of participation, which is a very intricate, exotic, opaque sort of Wall Street scheme, which is usually used, and was used in this case, by the city to evade laws that limit the amount of money the city can borrow. See, in other words, they're not actually supposedly borrowing the money by selling bonds. They're doing something else, certificates of participation. Half of that, basically loan, was in the form of what they called interest rate swaps, in which essentially the city bet that interest rates would either stay where they were or would go up, in which case it would be the banks that would pay the difference, not the city. The banks were betting that interest rates would go down. The banks, of course, knew that interest rates were going to go down because they were bankrupting the economy and creating the conditions for the housing crash and the Wall Street crash of 2008, which they knew the Federal Reserve would respond to by bringing interest rates down to zero. So the result is that the city has been paying a tribute of tens of millions of dollars every year to these two financial institutions, which played a major role in sort of throwing the city into the situation which could be used to file for bankruptcy by Orr and his fellow conspirators. This brief review of the facts shows that the city's financial crisis is a result of the crisis of American capitalism and the vampire-like role of the banks and investment firms that prey on the city and its population. The claim that there is no money for pensions, wages, health care, jobs, schools, etc., is another big lie. As the Detroit crisis demonstrates, the real problem is the staggering concentration of wealth in the hands of a parasitic financial corporate elite that comprises a tiny percentage of the population. What is the situation of Detroit workers? What is the result of this process? Per capita income in Detroit as of 2010 was $15,062, about 58% of the national average. Median household income in the city in 2011 was $25,193, less than half the national average. Some 35.5% of Detroit families were living in poverty, more than 3 times the national rate. The percentage of Detroit children in poverty was 57.3. That is more than 2.5 times the percentage nationally. On the other hand, the big 3 auto companies reported this month a combined profit for 2013 of $13.8 billion. Ford, which reported $7.2 billion for the year, has amassed $42 billion in profit over the past 5 years. The staggering rebound in auto profits is the direct result of the destruction of workers' wages and benefits imposed as part of the Obama administration's forced bankruptcy of GM and Chrysler in 2009. Auto workers' wages in the U.S. have declined 10% since then. Ford's 5-year profit is more than twice the size of Detroit's long-term debt, which, according to emergency manager Orr, is $18 billion. Dan Gilbert, the CEO of Quicken Loans and co-chair of the Detroit Blight Removal Task Force, is worth $3.9 billion. His wealth has quadrupled since the Wall Street crash of September 2008. Gilbert has bought some 40 properties in the downtown area and is set to profit massively from the eviction of low-income tenants and upscale development of a part of the city center. His appointment as co-chair of the panel overseeing the demolition of sections of the city is a flagrant conflict of interest, since he stands to make millions from the decisions taken by the Blight Removal Board. Mike Ilitch, owner of Little Caesars Pizza and Olympia Development, is worth $2.4 billion. He is another prime mover in the restructuring and downsizing of Detroit. Earlier this month, the City Council approved the handover of virtually free of charge of 39 parcels of land to Ilitch to build a new stadium for his Detroit Red Wings professional ice hockey team. Some $285 million in state funds, plus $12.8 to $15 million per year in city funds, will be used to cover most of the construction costs. Ilitch will pay no rent and no property taxes on the stadium and pocket all the revenues. Not a bad deal. The $285 million in direct subsidies, it should be pointed out, is greater than the cash shortfall of Detroit. This past Monday, GM announced that its new CEO, Mary Barra, will be paid $14.4 million this year, 60% more than her predecessor. Her compensation is 5,760 times the median household income in Detroit. Social inequality in America has reached levels never before seen. Where is the money? It is in the bank accounts, stock portfolios, investment trusts of the richest 1% of the population, and the bulk of that wealth is in the hands of the richest 0.1%. In conclusion, I just want to briefly respond to some of the questions that have come up in the discussion. For example, why are they privatizing the water department when it makes no economic sense? And questions of tax abatements and stadiums and so forth. The point is that what is taking place is not based on rationality or even economic sense. There is a class struggle. The attacks on the working class, the bankruptcy of Detroit, is part of a political agenda being carried out by a ruling class, a financial corporate aristocracy, which has a definite agenda. It's being driven by an economic crisis, but it has a definite political agenda, which is to impoverish the working class, reverse all of the gains won by workers over a century of struggle, increase exploitation, and grab the money for themselves. So the answer to the crisis is in the development of the class struggle by the working class on the basis of a conscious, worked-out, political, revolutionary program. That's what we seek to achieve through this inquiry and the work that will follow it. Thank you.